The winter air hung heavy over Manhattan on Christmas Eve, 1997. The city sprawled beneath a darkening sky, its towers reaching upward like fingers grasping at stars they could never touch. In the streets below, last-minute shoppers hurried between storefronts blazing with holiday decorations, their breath forming small clouds in the cold. Yellow taxicabs crawled through congested intersections, their horns creating a symphony of urban impatience. Street vendors sold roasted chestnuts and hot pretzels to passers-by seeking warmth against the December chill. Children pressed their faces against department store windows, marveling at elaborate holiday displays, while their parents checked watches and calculated how many stops remained on their shopping lists. This was New York City at its most quintessentially alive. Millions of people sharing the same streets, the same air, the same anticipation of the holiday to come. Somewhere in this vast urban landscape, nestled among the canyons of steel and glass, Carnegie Hall stood as a monument to culture and refinement, its warm lights promising an evening of sophistication and art. The building had witnessed over a century of performances, had hosted the greatest musicians and singers the world had ever known, had become synonymous with artistic excellence. Tonight it would host an opera, a medieval tale of forbidden love and tragic fate, performed by a cast that included one of the city's rising stars. The tickets had sold out weeks in advance. The audience members who filed through the ornate entrance wore their finest evening attire, eager to participate in a tradition that connected them to generations of culture lovers who had walked these same halls. But on this particular night, as snow began to fall in gentle spirals outside those hallowed walls, the promise of beauty and art would be broken in ways no one could have imagined. This is the story of Parasite Eve, a tale that begins with the highest aspirations of human creativity and ends in biological horror. A narrative that forces us to confront the terrible possibility that the greatest threat to humanity might not come from outside, but from within, from the very cells that comprise our bodies. To understand what happened that Christmas Eve, we must first understand something fundamental about life itself. Inside every cell of every living creature on Earth exists a structure called mitochondria. These tiny organelles, invisible to the naked eye, number in the hundreds or thousands within each cell, depending on the cell's energy requirements. They serve as the powerhouses of the cell, converting oxygen and nutrients into a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, commonly known as ATP, the energy currency that fuels every movement, every thought, every heartbeat. The process by which they accomplish this, called cellular respiration, is remarkably efficient, extracting far more energy from glucose than any human-designed engine could manage. Without mitochondria, complex life as we know it could not exist. We would be nothing more than simple organisms, incapable of the sustained energy output that allows us to think, to move, to exist as the complex beings we are. But here is where the story becomes strange, unsettling in its implications. Mitochondria possess their own DNA, separate and distinct from the genetic code stored in the cell's nucleus. This mitochondrial DNA is circular, like bacterial DNA, rather than the linear chromosomes found in our nuclei. Mitochondria also reproduce independently within our cells, dividing on their own schedule, rather than waiting for the cell itself to divide. They have their own ribosomes, their own genetic code, their own evolutionary history. This is because approximately 1.5 to 2 billion years ago, mitochondria were not part of us at all. They were independent organisms, free-living bacteria, that somehow merged with our ancestral cells in a relationship scientists call endosymbiosis. The exact details of how this merger occurred remain debated, but the result is clear. We did not conquer mitochondria. We did not enslave them. Something more like a partnership developed, and together we became something neither could have been alone. It was, by all accounts, one of the most successful biological partnerships in the history of life on Earth. Every animal, every plant, every fungus that exists today carries mitochondria in their cells, descendants of that ancient merger. This partnership has lasted for nearly 2 billion years without significant incident. Mitochondria provide energy. Host cells provide raw materials and protection. Both benefit, both continue. The arrangement seems stable, permanent, as fundamental to life as breathing or eating. But what happens when something goes wrong with that partnership? What happens when the cellular machinery we depend on begins to malfunction in ways no one anticipated? What happens when biology, usually so reliable in its patterns, suddenly produces something unprecedented and terrifying? New York City in the late 1990s was a place of contrasts and contradictions. The financial district gleamed with new money and new power, the stock market climbing toward heights that seemed to promise endless prosperity. Technology companies were transforming how people communicated, worked, and entertained themselves. The internet was moving from academic curiosity to household utility. The city felt like it was on the cusp of something new, something transformative, a future that will be better than the past in ways both predictable and surprising. Yet even amid this optimism, older problems persisted. Neighborhoods in the outer boroughs still bore the scars of decades of decline. Homelessness remained visible on many streets. The gap between those who benefited from the new economy and those who did not continued to widen. The city was changing, gentrifying, becoming something other than what it had been. And in that transformation, there was both promise and loss, both hope and anxiety. For Aya Brea, a 25-year-old rookie detective with the New York Police Department, the city was simply home, the only place she had truly known since the tragedy that had shaped her entire life. She had been born in Boston, but her memories of that time were fragmentary, overshadowed by what came later. Her mother, Mariko, was Japanese, elegant and gentle, with a quiet strength that Aya would only fully appreciate years after losing her. Her father was a journalist of European descent, curious and driven, always chasing the next story. And she had an older sister named Maya who meant everything to her. Maya was the one who held her hand during thunderstorms, who read her stories at bedtime, who made her feel safe in a world that could sometimes seem overwhelming to a small child. Their childhood was ordinary in most respects, two sisters growing up in a loving family, sharing the small adventures and minor dramas that constitute normal life, until the day that changed everything. The accident happened when Aya was young. She, Maya, and their mother Mariko were in a car traveling through the city when something went terribly wrong. The circumstances of the crash were never fully clear to Aya, though fragments of memory would surface throughout her life, pieces of a puzzle she could never quite assemble. Some accounts suggested that Mariko might have been experiencing something strange in the moments before impact, her body growing unusually warm, her behavior erratic, as though something was happening inside her that she could not control. Whatever the cause, the results were catastrophic. The vehicle collided with another car at an intersection. Metal crumpled, glass shattered. The sounds of the crash would echo in Aya's nightmares for years afterward, even when she could not consciously remember what had happened. Mariko and Maya were both mortally wounded in the collision. Emergency responders arrived quickly, their sirens cutting through the ordinary sounds of the city, and the 3 victims were transported to St. Francis Hospital in New York City. Doctors fought desperately to save them, employing every technique and technology available, but it was too late for Mariko and Maya. Both were pronounced dead, their injuries too severe to overcome despite the best efforts of the medical staff. Young Aya survived, injured but alive, waking in a hospital bed to learn that her mother and sister were gone, that the family she had known was shattered beyond repair, that she would have to find a way to continue in a world that had suddenly become much colder and more frightening. What happened next was documented in hospital records, but understood by almost no one at the time. Mariko had registered herself and Maya as organ donors, a decision made during some routine administrative moment, a checkbox on her ICHA form that seemed purely theoretical until it suddenly was not. Following their deaths, the medical staff at St. Francis proceeded with organ harvesting, following established protocols for donation. Maya's kidney was transplanted into a young girl named Melissa Pierce, who was hospitalized at St. Francis for kidney failure around the same time. It was a coincidence of timing, nothing more. 2 tragedies intersecting in a way that would save one life while failing to save another. Maya's cornea was preserved for later use, eventually transplanted into Aya herself to correct an eye defect, giving her back full vision, while also giving her something else, something no one could have anticipated or understood. A young hospital intern named Hans Klamp was present during these operations, observing as part of his medical training. He took note of what occurred, particularly certain unusual characteristics of Maya's organs that the senior surgeons dismissed as statistical anomalies, minor variations within normal parameters. Klamp filed this information away in his memory, a curious data point that would resurface years later when his research interests led him in unexpected directions. The full significance of these transplants would not become apparent for 2 decades, but the seeds of future catastrophe were planted in that hospital, in those operating rooms, in the organs that passed from the dead to the living, carrying something unprecedented within their cellular structures. Aya grew up without her mother and sister, the loss creating a void that would never fully heal. Her father did his best to care for her, but his grief was overwhelming, and eventually the demands of single parenthood exceeded what he could manage. Aya was placed in foster care, moving through the system, adapting to new homes and new families with a resilience that masked deeper wounds. She learned to be self-sufficient, to not depend too heavily on connections that might be severed without warning. She learned to observe carefully, to assess situations before committing to them, to protect herself from disappointments by expecting them. These survival skills would serve her well in her later career, though they came at the cost of emotional openness, of the easy intimacy that others seem to achieve without effort. Despite the challenges of her upbringing, Aya excelled academically. She was drawn to structure, to rules, to systems that made sense and could be relied upon. She studied criminology at the University of Virginia, finding in the field a combination of intellectual challenge and practical purpose that satisfied her deeply. She participated in the Reserve Officers Training Corps program, developing physical capabilities and leadership skills that complemented her academic training. And eventually, she made her way to New York City, to the NYPD, to a career that would allow her to protect others from the kind of sudden, senseless loss she had experienced as, a child. She worked her way up to detective in just 3 years, earning a reputation for dedication and competence that belied her youth and relative inexperience. She was partnered with Daniel Dollis, a veteran officer in his 40s whose weathered face and world-weary demeanor masked a fundamentally decent heart. Daniel had seen too much in his decades on the force, had witnessed humanity at its worst often enough that cynicism would have been understandable. But he retained a core of genuine caring beneath his gruff exterior, a belief that the job mattered, that protecting people was worth the sacrifices it demanded. He was going through a divorce, his marriage having finally collapsed under the weight of too many late nights and missed dinners and conversations cut short by emergency calls. His son Ben was caught in the middle, loved by both parents, but inevitably affected by their inability to remain together. Daniel threw himself into his work partly to escape the pain of his failing home life, partly because the work itself still mattered to him in ways he could not fully articulate. The partnership between Aya and Daniel worked despite their differences, or perhaps because of them. She was young, energetic, still idealistic enough to believe that doing the right thing would generally produce good results. He was older, more cautious, aware of how often good intentions led to unintended consequences. She pushed him to take action. He taught her to consider outcomes. Their colleagues sometimes called them the father and daughter team, and there was truth in that description, a protective quality in Daniel's approach to mentoring his young partner that reminded observers of parental care. On Christmas Eve 1997, Aya found herself attending an opera at Carnegie Hall. This was not her natural habitat. She preferred action movies to classical performance, rock music to arias, the directness of contemporary entertainment to the formal traditions of high culture. But a colleague from the department had asked her out, had suggested the opera as a way to impress her, and she had agreed because saying no would have required an explanation she did not feel like providing. So here she was, wearing a dress that felt slightly unfamiliar, following her nervous date through the grand entrance of Carnegie Hall, past the red carpets and golden fixtures, into the auditorium where hundreds of people sat waiting for the performance to begin. The hall itself was magnificent, all Baroque splendor and acoustic perfection. Crystal chandeliers caught the light and scattered it across the ceiling in patterns that seemed almost magical. The seats were upholstered in deep red velvet, comfortable enough for a long evening of performance. The audience members chatted quietly among themselves, programs rustling as they reviewed the evening's entertainment, anticipation building as the scheduled start time approached. Aya took her seat beside her, Date, whose name history has not preserved, and tried to settle into a mindset appropriate for opera appreciation. She felt an odd sensation as she sat there, a warmth spreading through her body that she attributed to the crowd and the excitement of the evening and the slight embarrassment of being somewhere she did not quite belong. She could not have known that her cells were already responding to something, already beginning to react to a presence in the building that shared their unique biological heritage. The opera that night told a medieval tale, a story of forbidden love between a prince named Edward and a woman called Eva, who was accused of witchcraft. The narrative followed familiar patterns of doomed romance and tragic fate, lovers separated by social convention and supernatural fear, reunited only in death. The music was beautiful, the staging elaborate, the performers clearly talented and committed to their roles. The actress playing Eva was named Melissa Pierce, and she commanded the stage with a presence that seemed almost otherworldly. Her voice filled the hall with power and emotion, reaching the back rows without apparent effort, conveying the character's passion and desperation through pure sound. Melissa was in her early 30s, tall and striking, with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to capture and hold the stage lights. She had worked for years to reach this moment, to claim a leading role in a major production at one of the world's most prestigious venues. Her path had not been easy. Since receiving that kidney transplant as a child, she had been constantly ill, in and out of hospitals, taking immunosuppressant drugs to prevent her body from rejecting the transplanted organ. The medications kept her alive, but left her vulnerable to infections, fatigued, never quite at full strength. She blamed the drugs for her chronic illness, never suspecting that the kidney itself might be the source of something far stranger than mere medical complications. In the weeks before tonight's performance, Melissa's health had deteriorated significantly. She experienced fevers that came and went without explanation, moments of disorientation when her thoughts seemed to scatter beyond her control, physical sensations that she could not describe to doctors because they did not fit any recognized symptom patterns. She responded to these warning signs by taking more immunosuppressant medication than prescribed, terrified that her body was finally rejecting the kidney, that she would lose her health at the very moment when her career was finally taking off. The additional medication weakened her immune system further while doing nothing to address the actual source of her symptoms. She was making herself more vulnerable to something she could not understand, something that had been developing inside her for 20 years. Another actress named Suzanne had been double cast for the lead role, insurance against exactly the kind of health problems that plagued Melissa. But Suzanne had recently died in an apartment fire, a tragedy that shocked the production company, but also, secretly, relieved Melissa. Now the role was hers alone. There was no understudy waiting in the wings, no backup plan if she failed. The pressure of this responsibility, combined with her deteriorating health and her medication abuse, created a perfect storm of physical and psychological stress. She felt strange as she took the stage that evening, her body warmer than it should have been, her thoughts occasionally seeming to come from somewhere outside herself. But she pushed through, determined to deliver the performance of her lifetime, unaware that she was about to become something other than human. The performance proceeded beautifully through the first act. Melissa's voice soared through the hall. Her acting conveyed genuine emotion. The audience sat transfixed by the unfolding drama. Then came the pivotal scene where Eva declares her love for Prince Edward, despite knowing the cost. Melissa stepped forward to deliver her aria, the music swelling around her, and as she sang, her eyes swept across the audience. Her gaze met Aya's, and for one impossible moment everything seemed to stop. Something happened in that instant of eye contact, something that neither woman understood. The cells they shared, the mitochondria descended from Aya Brea's organs, recognized each other across the distance. It was not conscious recognition, not anything either could have articulated, but a biological resonance that transcended normal sensory experience. In Melissa, this recognition triggered something that had been building for months. Her mitochondria, which had been slowly asserting influence over her cellular processes, suddenly surged to full activation. And in that surge, they reached out to the mitochondria in every other person in the building, sending a signal that commanded those cellular components to produce energy at catastrophic rates. The audience began to burn. It happened so quickly that many initially thought it was part of the show, some elaborate special effect to heighten the drama of the witchcraft accusations in the opera's plot. An actor on stage, one of the soldiers meant to arrest Eva, suddenly burst into flames. Not the slow spread of fire catching on fabric, but instant, total combustion, as though his body had been transformed into fuel and ignited all at once. He screamed, a sound that cut through the music and echoed off the walls, and stumbled forward, his arms flailing uselessly against flames that came from within rather than without. He fell from the stage into the orchestra pit, and that was when the panic truly began. Throughout the auditorium, bodies began to ignite. The combustion seemed random at first, striking people in scattered locations, but it spread with terrifying speed. A woman in the front row burst into flames while her husband watched in horror. A group of elderly patrons in the balcony combusted almost simultaneously, their burning bodies tumbling over the railing to fall upon those below. The air filled with smoke and the smell of burning flesh, a stench so overwhelming that it made breathing painful for those not yet affected. People screamed and trampled each other in desperate attempts to escape, but the exit seemed impossibly far away, and for many, death came before they could reach them. Some audience members did manage to flee into the streets, their bodies already beginning to burn, collapsing on the sidewalk outside Carnegie Hall in full view of horrified passers-by. Their deaths served as witness to the impossible events occurring inside, proof that this was not a contained incident, but something that threatened anyone who came too close. Aya sat frozen in her seat. Her date collapsed beside her, his body consumed in seconds, reduced to ash and charred remains before her eyes. The heat from his combustion washed over her, yet she did not burn. She should have died too. By every law of physics and biology, she should have combusted along with everyone else in that hall. The same signal that triggered the deaths of hundreds reached her cells as well, commanded her mitochondria to release their energy in the same catastrophic manner. But something in her physiology, something connected to the cornea she had received from Maya, prevented that command from executing. Her mitochondria received the signal but did not obey it. They remained stable, continued their normal function, protected their host from the fate that claimed everyone around her. Aya sat surrounded by death and destruction, completely unharmed, and the only thought that penetrated the shock was a simple, terrible question. Why? Why was she alive when her date was dead? Why was she spared when the elegant couple across the aisle had burned to nothing? Why her and not anyone else? The questions would haunt her for days to come, but in this moment, training took over. The instincts drilled into her at the academy and refined through years on the force. She was a police officer. There was a threat. She needed to respond. She rose to her feet, her legs shaking but functional, and drew the service weapon she carried even off duty. The small handgun felt reassuring in her grip, familiar and reliable, a tool she understood in a situation that defied understanding. She began moving toward the stage, stepping over bodies and through ashes, her eyes fixed on the one other person in the hall who remained alive. Melissa Pierce still stood at center stage, untouched by the flames that had consumed everyone else. And as Aya approached, she could see that something fundamental had changed in the woman's appearance. Melissa's eyes glowed with an eerie greenish light, pulsing with energy that seemed to emanate from within her skull, rather than reflecting any external source. Her skin had taken on an unusual pallor, and she held herself differently, with a confidence and power that seemed at odds with the frail opera singer she had been minutes before. When she spoke, her voice carried strange harmonics, overtones that resonated not in the air, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that made Aya's bones ache and her teeth tingle. The being that had been Melissa informed Aya that she was impressed by her survival. She said that Aya's mitochondria must be more developed than expected, that they had resisted the signal when they should have complied. She spoke of these biological matters as though discussing something obvious, something anyone should understand, and her casual tone made the horror of the surrounding carnage even more surreal. She declared that she was no longer Melissa, that Melissa was just the vessel, the host body for something that had been growing inside her for 20 years. She called herself Eve, and she spoke of plans that Aya could not yet understand, of a new form of life she intended to create, of humanity serving purposes they could not imagine. Aya demanded answers, demanded to know what had happened, what Eve had done to all these people. Eve's response was almost pitying. She explained that she had simply asked the mitochondria of everyone in the hall to release their energy, and they had complied because they recognized her authority. Only Aya's mitochondria had refused, had remained loyal to their host rather than answering Eve's call. This made Aya interesting, Eve admitted, potentially useful, certainly worth preserving for further study. But that study would have to wait. Eve had other business to attend to, a plan years in the making that was finally ready to proceed. Then Eve transformed, her body shifting and mutating in ways that should have been impossible. Her legs fused together into a black, tail-like appendage that supported her weight while leaving her hands free. Her fingers lengthened into claws capable of rending flesh and steel alike. Her hair seemed to take on a life of its own, writhing like separate organisms attached to her scalp. She levitated off the stage, demonstrating power that defied gravity and physics and everything Aya understood about reality. And then she descended into the darkness beneath Carnegie Hall, finding passages into the sewers that ran beneath the city, leaving Aya alone with the dead and dying, with hundreds of corpses and the lingering smell of burned flesh, with questions that had no answers and a determination to find them anyway. Aya pursued her into the darkness. She found a maintenance access that led to tunnels beneath the building, the infrastructure of pipes and conduits that supported the great hall above. These passages connected to the larger sewer system, a maze of tunnels running beneath Manhattan that most citizens never thought about, that existed only as abstract concept until circumstances forced direct encounter. The tunnels reeked of age and decay, of human waste and stagnant water, and things best left unexamined. Aya's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing brick walls stained by decades of moisture, rats scurrying away from the unexpected intrusion, the detritus of urban existence collected in corners and alcoves. The rats began to change as she watched. Their bodies twisted and grew, bones cracking and reforming, flesh stretching to accommodate new configurations. Some grew to the size of large dogs. Others sprouted additional limbs or developed jaws capable of crushing bone. Their eyes took on the same greenish glow that Eve's had displayed, marking them as something other than ordinary animals. These were the first neo-mitochondrial creatures, or NMCs, living organisms transformed by Eve's influence into something hostile and deadly. The transformation affected only living tissue with active cellular processes, required functional mitochondria to manipulate and reshape. Dead matter remained inert, but anything alive was vulnerable to Eve's power. Aya fought her way through these mutated creatures, her service weapon proving effective but limited. The bullets killed the smaller NMCs, but barely slowed the larger ones. She had to aim for vital areas, had to make every shot count, had to keep moving because standing still meant being overwhelmed. In the course of this desperate combat, she discovered something unexpected. Energy was building within her. power that she could feel accumulating in her cells, pressure that demanded release. When she finally let that energy flow, it manifested as heat and light, an ability that damaged the NMCs more effectively than her bullets. She had developed what she would come to call parasite energy, biological capabilities granted by her awakening mitochondria. The confrontation with Eve had triggered something in her cells, had accelerated a process that might otherwise have taken years or never occurred at all. She was becoming capable of things that should have been impossible, though she did not yet understand what that meant or what price it might demand. The chase through the sewers continued for what felt like hours. Aya pursuing Eve through twisting passages and flooded chambers, fighting NMCs that emerged from the darkness with increasing frequency. The pursuit culminated in a large chamber where she encountered something far worse than mutated rats. An alligator had been living in these sewers, one of the urban legends that turned out to be true, and Eve's influence had transformed it into something monstrous. The creature was enormous, easily 20 feet long, its scales hardened into armor, its jaws capable of snapping a human in half. It attacked with the single-minded ferocity of a predator, and Aya found herself fighting for her life against something that outweighed her by hundreds of pounds and seemed immune to conventional weapons. She defeated the creature through a combination of gunfire, parasite energy, and desperate improvisation. The battle exhausted her reserves, left her trembling with fatigue, but she survived, which was more than she had expected when the fight began. She emerged from the sewers into the night air, gasping and covered in filth, to find that emergency services had arrived at Carnegie Hall. Police cars and fire trucks surrounded the building, their lights painting the streets in alternating red and blue. EMTs treated survivors who had escaped before combusting, while officers attempted to establish a perimeter and control the growing crowd of onlookers. The officers could not enter the building. Anyone who tried found their body temperature rising rapidly, the early stages of the same combustion that had killed the audience. They retreated with red faces and steaming clothes, confused and frightened by an effect they could not explain. Only Aya was unaffected. Only she could approach without triggering the deadly heat. When the final count was tallied in the days that followed, the Carnegie Hall massacre had claimed hundreds of lives, making it one of the deadliest incidents in the city's history. The cause remained officially unexplained, attributed to unknown factors, while investigators struggled to understand what had actually occurred. The next morning brought Christmas Day to a city in shock. News of the Carnegie Hall massacre dominated every broadcast. Reporters speculating about terrorism, about gas leaks, about industrial accidents, about anything that might explain the inexplicable. The official story remained vague, authorities unwilling to share information they themselves did not understand. Aya reported to the 17th precinct despite the holiday, finding the station in a state of controlled chaos. Officers who should have been home with their families had come in voluntarily, driven by the same need to do something that had brought Aya herself. Captain Douglas Baker, a cold and demanding man who tolerated neither excuses nor failures, held a press conference where he attempted to maintain some kind of coherent public narrative. Aya interrupted the conference to share what she had witnessed, describing Eve and the transformation and the NMCs in terms that made reporters question her sanity and colleagues question her judgment. But Daniel Dollis believed her. He had seen too much in his years on the force to dismiss the impossible out of hand. He had learned that the world contained more than textbooks and training manuals acknowledged, that sometimes the job required confronting things that official protocols never anticipated. He took Aya aside after the press conference, asked her to tell him everything again, listened without interrupting while she described the opera and the flames and the creature that had been Melissa Pierce. When she finished, he nodded slowly and said they needed to talk to someone who understood biology, someone who might be able to explain what was happening in terms that could lead to practical solutions. They went to the American Museum of Natural History, seeking a scientist whose expertise in mitochondria had earned him a certain reputation in academic circles. Dr. Hans Klamp worked in the museum's laboratory, surrounded by microscopes and specimens and equipment that hummed with quiet purpose. He was thin and bespectacled, with a beard that needed trimming and an air of irritation that suggested he resented any interruption to his work. When Aya and Daniel arrived, he was dismissive and unhelpful, explaining basic concepts about mitochondria without providing any insight into how they might cause spontaneous combustion. He told them that mitochondria were the powerhouses of cells, that they generated energy through cellular respiration, that they possessed their own DNA separate from the cell's nucleus. He spoke of how all mitochondria in humans were inherited through the maternal line, how scientists could trace mitochondrial lineages back through generations, how a theoretical common ancestor called mitochondrial Eve represented the point from which all human mitochondrial DNA descended. But when Daniel and Aya pressed him for more practical information, for anything that might help them understand or stop what was happening, Klamp grew hostile. He demanded they leave him to his research, claimed he had nothing more to offer, practically pushed them out of his laboratory. As they departed, Aya felt a strange recognition, a sense that she had seen Klamp's face before, though she could not remember where or when. What she did not know, what she would not learn until later, was that Klamp had been the intern at St. Francis Hospital 20 years ago, the one who had observed Maya's organ harvesting, the one who had noted unusual characteristics in those organs and filed the information away for future reference. He knew more than he was telling, far more, but his reasons for concealment were his own. That afternoon, everything accelerated. Reports came in that Eve had been spotted in Central Park. Worse, a crowd had gathered there for a concert that Melissa Pierce was supposed to perform, a special Christmas show that had been advertised for weeks. Despite the Carnegie Hall tragedy, despite warnings from authorities, despite every indication that large gatherings posed unprecedented danger, hundreds of people had come to the park. Some were drawn by morbid curiosity, wanting to see the famous singer who had somehow survived the massacre. Others simply refused to believe that such horror could repeat itself, that lightning might strike twice. Still others had not heard the warnings, had been traveling or busy, or simply disconnected from the news cycle that dominated everyone else's attention. Whatever their reasons, they gathered in the park's amphitheater, sitting on benches and blankets, waiting for a performance that would never occur as advertised. Daniel attempted to enter the park, but was driven back almost immediately. His body temperature began rising as soon as he crossed the perimeter, the early stages of combustion manifesting as flushed skin and difficulty breathing. He retreated, frustrated and frightened, forced to acknowledge that conventional law enforcement could not address this threat. Only Aya was immune. Only she could proceed without triggering the deadly effect. She entered the park alone, her weapon drawn, her newly discovered parasite energy ready to deploy if needed, knowing that whatever waited inside was beyond anything her training had prepared her for. What she found in the amphitheater was worse than Carnegie Hall. The audience had not simply burned this time. They had melted, their bodies dissolving into a viscous orange substance that pooled together at the base of the stage. The biomass pulsed with unnatural energy, seeming almost alive despite being composed of dead tissue. Eve stood above this mass of transformed flesh, her arms raised, her voice lifted in what might have been song, or might have been something else entirely. She was gathering the remains, Aya realized, collecting the dissolved bodies for some purpose that was becoming horrifyingly clear. The orange biomass was raw material, genetic information stripped from hundreds of victims, and Eve intended to use it. Aya confronted Eve, demanded she stop, demanded explanations that Eve seemed almost amused to provide. Eve spoke of plans that had been forming for years, of a new kind of life she intended to create, of humanity serving as raw material for something greater. She called this creation the ultimate being, a creature that would possess capabilities beyond anything that currently existed. Aya could not fully understand what Eve described, could not grasp the biological concepts she referenced, but she understood enough to know that it had to be stopped. She attacked, channeling her parasite energy into offensive form, firing her weapon at the creature that had been Melissa Pierce. Eve responded with power that dwarfed anything Aya could muster. She had grown stronger since Carnegie Hall, her control over her transformed body more refined, her abilities more devastating. She could generate beams of energy that scorched the ground where they struck. She could manipulate living things around her, commanding their mitochondria to transform them into NMCs. She could levitate and move with speed that defied physical law. The battle raged across the amphitheater, Aya dodging and firing and channeling her powers, while Eve attacked with almost casual superiority. But Eve was not trying to kill her. She seemed more interested in testing Aya, in measuring her potential, in understanding why Aya's mitochondria had evolved so differently than her own. The battle ended inconclusively when Eve retreated, taking the mass of orange biomass with her. She descended into the sewers again, into the maze of tunnels beneath the city, leaving Aya exhausted and confused in the ruins of the amphitheater. In the aftermath, as police finally managed to approach the scene now that Eve had departed, Daniel discovered something that transformed his relationship to the crisis. His son Ben had been at the park. Ben had come with his mother Lorraine to see the concert, had been sitting in the audience when Eve appeared, had witnessed things no child should ever see. Ben had managed to escape, had run when the chaos began, had survived through luck and speed, and the intervention of adults who shielded him with their bodies. But Lorraine had not been so fortunate. She was among the victims, her body dissolved into that terrible orange substance, leaving Daniel to grieve while simultaneously trying to protect the city from further attacks. The case had become personal in the worst possible way. During these early days of the crisis, a Japanese scientist named Kunihiko Maeda managed to make contact with the NYPD. Maeda was middle-aged, soft-spoken, wearing a rumpled suit and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. His English was imperfect, sometimes causing communication difficulties, but his knowledge of mitochondria was extensive. He had been researching unusual mitochondrial behavior for years, following theoretical models and anomalous reports that suggested mitochondria might be capable of things conventional biology did not acknowledge. When he heard about the Carnegie Hall incident, he recognized patterns that matched his research and traveled to New York immediately, determined to help if he could. Maeda met with Aya and Daniel at the precinct, sharing his theories about what they were facing. Believed that Eve was attempting to create what he called an ultimate being, a creature with unprecedented biological capabilities. This being would be able to control its own cellular processes consciously, to direct its own evolution, to adapt to any threat or environment. The orange biomass Eve had been gathering was presumably genetic material to be incorporated into this creation. The sperm Eve would need to fertilize her eggs and begin the ultimate being's development would have to come from somewhere, and Maida suspected she would target a location where such material was readily available. His theories sounded fantastical, but given what Aya had already witnessed, she could not dismiss them. The investigation continued over the following days, Aya exploring locations across Manhattan as she tracked Eve's movements and gathered information about her plan. Much of the city remained populated during this time, ordinary life continuing even as monsters lurked in the shadows. People went to work, celebrated the holidays, complained about traffic and weather and the thousand small annoyances of urban existence. They had heard about Carnegie Hall and Central Park, had seen the news coverage and the official statements, but many could not truly believe that such things were real, could not accept that the world had changed in fundamental ways. This denial was perhaps understandable, perhaps even necessary for psychological survival, but it also meant that potential victims continued going about their business, continued gathering in public spaces, continued making themselves vulnerable to threats they refused to acknowledge. The police precinct itself came under attack when Eve manifested there, demonstrating that nowhere was truly safe. She appeared without warning in the middle of the station, her presence triggering immediate chaos as officers reached for weapons they knew would be ineffective. She did not attack the humans directly this time. Instead, she demonstrated her ability to transform living creatures into NMCs by targeting a police dog named Shiva. The animal had been a beloved member of the department, a trained K-9 unit that had helped solve cases and apprehend criminals. Under Eve's influence, Shiva's body twisted and warped, bones cracking and reforming, flesh stretching to accommodate new configurations. The dog became something monstrous, unrecognizable, hostile to the humans who had cared for it. Aya was forced to destroy the creature that had once been Shiva, adding another trauma to the accumulating weight of this crisis. Eve's appearance at the precinct served multiple purposes. It demonstrated that she could strike anywhere, that the police were not safe in their own headquarters, that conventional security measures meant nothing against her power. It also allowed her to observe Aya more closely, to assess her developing abilities, to gauge how much of a threat she might eventually become. Eve seemed almost curious about Aya, interested in her as a scientific specimen rather than viewing her as a genuine opponent. This condescension would eventually prove to be a weakness, but for now it simply added to Aya's frustration, the sense that she was being toyed with by something that did not take her seriously. St. Francis Hospital became the next crucial location in the investigation. This was where everything had begun 20 years ago, where Maya's organs had been transplanted, where the seeds of the current crisis had been planted. Maida believed that Eve might target the hospital to obtain sperm, the genetic material she would need to create the ultimate being. Hospitals maintained sperm banks for fertility treatments, stored samples that would serve Eve's purposes perfectly. If she could obtain this material and combine it with the biomass she had already gathered, she would have everything necessary to begin her creation. Aya and Daniel entered the hospital to find it transformed into a nightmare. The building that should have been a place of healing had become a charnel house, its corridors dark and filled with NMCs. Patients and staff had been transformed by Eve's influence. their bodies warped into monstrous configurations, their minds apparently erased or overwritten by something that knew only hostility. Medical equipment that should have been saving lives stood abandoned or destroyed. The smell of death permeated everything, the particular odor of biological decay that no amount of antiseptic could fully mask. As Aya navigated the hospital's halls, fighting NMCs and searching for evidence of Eve's activities, she experienced something strange. Flashes of memory that did not belong to her began surfacing, glimpses of scenes she had never witnessed. She saw a young girl lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines and monitors, her face peaceful despite the tubes and wires connecting her to life support. She saw doctors conferring over charts, their expressions grave, their words inaudible but their meaning clear. She saw an operating room, bright lights shining down, surgeons working with practiced precision. These were Maya's memories, Aya realized, preserved somehow in the cornea she had received from her sister, surfacing now as her own mitochondrial abilities developed. She was seeing her sister's final days through cellular recollection, experiencing fragments of Maya's time in this very hospital. The experience was disorienting, sometimes overwhelming, but it also provided crucial information. Through these fragmentary memories, Aya gained insight into what had happened 20 years ago, into the circumstances surrounding the transplants that had set everything in motion. She saw glimpses of a young intern observing the operations, recognized the face as a younger version of Hans Klamp. She understood now that Klamp's interest in the transplants had not been casual, that he had been watching and recording and planning even then, even before anyone understood what Maya's organs represented. Eve had already come and gone from the hospital by the time Aya arrived, having obtained the sperm she needed, but the investigation revealed more about Klamp's involvement. He had maintained contact with the hospital over the years, had accessed records related to the transplant cases, had been conducting research that connected to Eve's current activities. Eve had reached out to him during the recent crisis, had manipulated him into helping with the scientific aspects of her plan. He had provided her with modified genetic material, sperm prepared according to specifications that would serve her purposes in creating the ultimate being. His motivation was not loyalty or devotion, but fascination. The cold curiosity of a researcher who wanted to see what would happen, who valued knowledge over ethics, who would sacrifice anything for the chance to witness something unprecedented. The investigation led next to the sewers beneath Chinatown, where the massive orange biomass from Central Park had been transported. Eve had established a kind of nest in these tunnels, a staging area where she could process the gathered material and prepare for the ultimate being's creation. Aya descended into the darkness once again, fighting through NMCs that had grown more numerous and more dangerous, navigating passages that twisted and turned in disorienting patterns. The deeper she went, the more the environment changed, the walls covered in organic growth, the air thick with humidity and strange smells, the boundary between constructed tunnel and biological space becoming increasingly unclear. She found the biomass pulsing in a large chamber, a mass of orange flesh that seemed to breathe, that responded to her presence with rippling movements across its surface. Eve was not present, having moved on to prepare the final stages of her plan, but the biomass itself seemed almost aware, almost alive in ways that went beyond simple cellular activity. Aya could not destroy it, could not find any way to harm the mass permanently, and eventually she was forced to retreat, to return to the surface and report what she had found. The clock was ticking towards something terrible, and she was running out of time to stop it. Aya and her companions returned to the museum for a final confrontation with Clamp. They found him in his laboratory, no longer bothering to hide his involvement. He seemed almost relieved to abandon pretense, to speak openly about what he had done and why. He explained that he had been fascinated by mitochondria since his days as a medical intern, when he had observed the transplant operations at St. Francis Hospital. Maya's organs had displayed unusual characteristics, cellular activity that did not match normal parameters, and Clamp had spent the subsequent decades trying to understand what made them special. When Eve emerged and revealed herself, when she demonstrated what awakened mitochondria could accomplish, Clamp had seen the culmination of everything he had studied. He had helped her because he wanted to see what would happen, wanted to witness the creation of the ultimate being, wanted to be part of something that would rewrite the rules of biology. His confession was delivered without remorse, without any apparent understanding of the suffering his assistants had enabled. He spoke of the victims at Carnegie Hall and Central Park as acceptable losses, necessary sacrifices for scientific progress. He described Eve's plan in clinical terms, as though discussing a laboratory experiment rather than the potential extinction of humanity. Daniel wanted to arrest him immediately, to drag him back to the precinct and let the justice system deal with his crimes. But before they could act, Clamp made a different choice. He called out to Eve, asking her to take him, to transform him, to make him part of the new world she was creating. His body burst into flames almost immediately, spontaneous combustion triggered by Eve's distant influence. The fire consumed him rapidly, but not so rapidly that he did not have time to scream, to feel the agony of his own cells turning against him. Aya tried to help him despite everything he had done, her instincts as a protector overriding her anger at his betrayal of humanity. But there was nothing she could do. Clamp died in his laboratory, surrounded by the research that had defined his life, a victim of the very forces he had helped unleash. With Clamp dead and the investigation reaching its climax, the focus shifted to Eve's final sanctuary. She had established herself in the museum itself, in chambers deep within the building, surrounded by the biomass that had formed an impermeable shield around her. The ultimate being was gestating within her transformed body, growing at accelerated rates, preparing to emerge into a world that was not ready for its existence. The shield of biomass absorbed bullets, resisted explosives, seemed impervious to any conventional attack. Aya could see Eve's pregnant form through the organic barrier, could see the creature developing inside her, but she could not reach her through normal means. The military became involved as the scope of the threat became undeniable. Evacuation orders finally went out across Manhattan, the authorities acknowledging that the situation had escalated beyond police capabilities. Citizens who had been going about their daily lives suddenly found themselves ordered to leave their homes, to abandon their businesses, to flee the city they had always considered safe. The evacuation was chaotic. Hundreds of thousands of people trying to leave simultaneously. Traffic gridlocked on every bridge and tunnel. Tempers flaring as fear replaced normalcy. The National Guard deployed to maintain order, but their presence only added to the sense that something unprecedented was occurring, that the rules which normally governed life had been suspended. But conventional military forces could not approach Eve without succumbing to the combustion effect. Soldiers who tried to enter her territory found their body temperatures rising rapidly, the early stages of the same death that had claimed so many already. They retreated, frustrated and frightened, forced to acknowledge that their weapons and training were useless against this particular threat. Only Aya remained immune. only she could approach without triggering the deadly response. The responsibility for stopping Eve fell on her shoulders alone. A plan was developed to get Aya to Eve's location. Eve had moved from the museum to Liberty Island, establishing her final nest near the Statue of Liberty itself, perhaps drawn by the symbolism of the location, or perhaps simply finding it strategically advantageous. Military assets would transport Aya as close as possible, providing whatever support they could from outside the danger zone. The assault would be costly, but there were no alternatives. If Eve succeeded in creating the ultimate being, the consequences would extend far beyond New York, far beyond the United States, potentially threatening all human life on Earth. The assault began with helicopters and naval vessels approaching Liberty Island from multiple directions. The military aircraft that got too close began experiencing equipment failures as their crews succumbed to rising temperatures, but each approach bought time, created distraction, allowed Aya to get closer to her target. Ships that entered the danger zone reported hull temperatures rising, crew members collapsing from heat exhaustion, systems failing in sequence. The losses were significant, but the operation succeeded in its primary objective. Aya reached Liberty Island, reached the area where Eve had established herself, reached the final confrontation that everything had been building toward. Eve awaited her there, pregnant and powerful, her body transformed beyond any resemblance to the opera singer she had once been. The biomass shield had been partially absorbed into her form, making her larger and more imposing than before. She no longer attempted to communicate as she had in their earlier encounters, no longer seemed interested in testing or observing Aya. The time for such games had passed. Now there was only the conflict, the final battle between two beings whose mitochondria had developed along divergent paths, whose existence had become incompatible. The battle was intense, the most difficult fight Aya had yet faced. Eve attacked with devastating power, energy beams that scorched the ground, physical strikes that could shatter stone, waves of force that threw Aya back whenever she tried to press her advantage. Aya responded with everything she had learned, every parasite energy technique she had developed, every weapon she had acquired and modified throughout the crisis. She dodged and weaved, attacked and retreated, looking for weaknesses in Eve's defenses while avoiding attacks that would kill her instantly if they connected. The battle seemed to last forever, though in reality, it probably consumed only minutes. Aya was pushed to her absolute limits, her reserves depleted, her body screaming for rest that she could not allow herself. But Eve was weakening too. The strain of gestating the ultimate being while simultaneously fighting at full power was taking its toll. Her cellular processes, pushed beyond sustainable limits, began to fail. Necrosis set in, her transformed body dying from the inside out, as her mitochondria burned themselves out in the effort to maintain her power. Eve collapsed, her form dissolving, becoming one with the biomass that had supported her. For a long moment, Aya simply stood there, exhausted and wounded, struggling to believe that it was over. She had won. Eve was dead. The threat was ended. She allowed herself to feel relief, to imagine returning to normal life, to contemplate a future where such horrors would fade into memory. She was wrong. The victory was incomplete. Aya made her way to a naval vessel that had survived the assault, seeking evacuation from Liberty Island. The sailors on board treated her with a mixture of awe and fear, unsure what to make of this woman who had done what entire military units could not. She was given water and medical attention, allowed to rest for the first time in what felt like days. But as she sat on the deck, watching the Manhattan skyline in the distance, The biomass she had thought destroyed began to churn with renewed purpose. Something was emerging from the orange mass, something that had survived Eve's death. The ultimate being had developed enough to exist independently, had reached sufficient maturity that its mother's demise did not prevent its birth. It pulled itself free from the biomass, revealing a form that was simultaneously humanoid and utterly alien. Its emergence began triggering dangerous reactions in everything around it, the same combustion effect that Eve had demonstrated, but somehow more intense, more immediate. Sailors on the ship began collapsing, their body temperatures spiking, their cells beginning the cascade toward combustion. Daniel and Maida watched from another vessel as the ultimate being attacked, as it began destroying the ship where Aya had taken refuge. The creature was powerful beyond anything they had anticipated, its form shifting and changing even as they watched, adapting to its environment, demonstrating the conscious control over its own biology that Eve had worked to create. It seemed unstoppable, seemed beyond any weapon or strategy they possessed. But Maida had been preparing something throughout the crisis, working in whatever time he could find between investigations and battles. He had developed special ammunition, bullets containing Aya's own cellular material. His theory was that her mitochondria, which had evolved along a different path than Eve's, might be incompatible with the ultimate being's biology. Bullets carrying her cells might be able to harm the creature in ways that conventional weapons could not. Daniel took the bullets from Maida and made his way toward the ship where Aya was fighting for her life. The transfer was dangerous, requiring him to approach closer to the ultimate being than was safe. His jacket caught fire during the approach, the heat intense enough to ignite fabric, even though it was not quite enough to trigger full combustion. He beat out the flames, pushed forward, managed to get the ammunition to Aya before being forced to retreat. It was a moment that could have been tragic, but became almost comedic in retrospect. Daniel slapping at his burning coat while shouting encouragement to his partner. Aya loaded the special bullets and resumed her fight against the ultimate being. The creature had evolved through multiple forms since its emergence, each transformation making it more powerful and more alien. It towered over her now, a mass of shifting flesh and exposed bone, of appendages that served purposes she could not identify, of sensory organs that tracked her movements with predatory precision. But the bullets containing her cells did something that conventional ammunition could not. They disrupted the creature's ability to control its own evolution, introduced chaos into the biological systems that required perfect coordination to function. The battle continued across the deck of the damaged ship, Aya firing and dodging and channeling her parasite energy, while the ultimate being adapted and attacked and refused to die. She realized that simply shooting the creature would not be enough, that she needed to destroy it completely, that leaving any part of it intact risked allowing it to regenerate. A plan formed in her mind, desperate and dangerous, but perhaps the only option available. She made her way to the ship's engine room, the ultimate being pursuing her through corridors that grew increasingly unstable as the vessel took damage. She found the controls for the boiler system, the pressure regulators that prevented catastrophic failure. Working quickly, drawing on knowledge she had acquired through investigation and intuition, she set the pressure to rise beyond safe limits, creating the conditions for an explosion that would consume the entire ship. Then she ran. The ultimate being followed, drawn by her presence, by the mitochondrial signature that marked her as prey. She led it through the ship's interior, toward the areas where the explosion would be most intense, timing her movements to maximize the damage while still leaving herself a chance to escape. At the last possible moment, she reached the deck and threw herself over the railing, plunging into the cold water of New York Harbor as the ship detonated behind her. The explosion consumed the ultimate being, the combined force of the blast and the fire destroying cellular structures faster than they could regenerate. The creature's scream, if something so alien could be said to scream, echoed across the water before cutting off abruptly. Debris rained down around Aya as she swam desperately away from the sinking vessel. And then there was silence, the profound quiet that follows catastrophic noise. She was rescued from the water by personnel from the surviving ships, pulled from the harbor and wrapped in blankets and treated for hypothermia and exhaustion. Daniel was there, his jacket still bearing scorch marks, his face showing the strain of everything they had endured. Maida was there too, already beginning to analyze what had happened, to understand the biological mechanisms that had made victory possible. Around them, the waters of the harbor reflected the lights of a city that had been saved, that would return to normal in the days and weeks ahead, that would eventually remember these events as a strange chapter in its long history. In the aftermath, as they gathered at the harbor while emergency crews managed the chaos of the evening, Maida explained what he had pieced together about Aya's immunity. Part of Maya was inside her, he said. When her mother and sister died in that car accident 20 years ago, Maya's cornea had been transplanted into Aya. The cells of that cornea contained Maya's mitochondria, preserved and functional, carrying something of Maya's biological identity into Aya's body. What Aya had been experiencing throughout the crisis, those flashes of memory, those moments of seeing through her sister's eyes, were Maya's cells responding to the crisis. Maya's mitochondria recognizing the threat and helping Aya survive it. Whether this constituted genuine consciousness, whether Maya's personality truly persisted in mitochondrial form, Maida could not say. The science was beyond anything he had studied, beyond anything humanity currently understood. But the practical result was clear. Maya, or whatever remained of her in those transplanted cells, had protected Aya. The combustion that killed so many others had not touched her, because her sister's mitochondria refused to obey Eve's commands, remained loyal to their host, shielded her from the signal that should have been fatal. It was a gift from beyond death, a final act of sisterly love encoded in cellular structures and preserved across 2 decades. Aya listened to this explanation with tears streaming down her face. She had lost Maya when she was just a child, had grown up with an absence that never fully healed. Now she understood that Maya had never truly left her, that her sister had been present throughout this crisis, watching over her, protecting her from threats she could not face alone. The knowledge did not undo the years of loss, did not restore the childhood they should have shared, but it provided something precious nonetheless. It provided connection. It provided closure. It provided proof that the bonds between sisters could transcend even death. In the days that followed, Manhattan slowly returned to life. The evacuation order was lifted after extensive testing confirmed that the mitochondrial threat had been neutralized. Citizens returned to their homes and apartments, to their businesses and routines, to the normal patterns of existence that had been so violently disrupted. The damage from the crisis was significant, both physical and psychological, but the city had survived worse, had rebuilt from worse, had always found ways to continue. The official explanation for the events attributed them to a biological incident, details classified, investigations ongoing. Most people accepted this explanation because the alternative, the truth, was too strange to process, too frightening to acknowledge. Aya returned to duty with the NYPD. Her role changed, but her commitment unchanged. She had abilities now that set her apart from other officers, knowledge of threats that most people would never encounter. A special unit was created to address biological incidents, with Aya as his primary operative. She hoped she would never be needed, that Eve and the ultimate being represented a unique occurrence that would not repeat. But she also understood that hope was not sufficient preparation, that vigilance was necessary, that the next threat might come without warning, just as this one had. She visited Maya's grave in the weeks after the crisis ended, standing in the cold January air, looking at the headstone that marked her sister's resting place. The Maya she remembered, the older sister who had held her hand and read her stories, was gone, had been gone for 20 years. But something of Maya remained in the cells Aya carried, in the protection those cells had provided, in the connection that had allowed her to survive when survival seemed impossible. She did not know if Maya's consciousness truly persisted, if her sister was aware in any meaningful sense of what had happened. But she chose to believe that Maya knew, that Maya had chosen to help her, that the love between them had found expression, even across the boundary of death. The story should have ended there, with the crisis resolved and the survivors beginning to heal. But there was one more chapter, available to those who returned to the city after the main events concluded, who noticed strange activity in the Chrysler building and chose to investigate. This was the X game, the bonus content that revealed a final confrontation, a last challenge for those who had mastered everything the main story demanded. The Chrysler building was one of Manhattan's most distinctive landmarks, its Art Deco spire recognizable from miles away, its architecture representing the optimism and ambition of an earlier era. In the weeks after the main crisis ended, reports began circulating of unusual activity in the building. Lights flickered in windows that should have been dark. Sounds emerged from floors that should have been empty. Security guards who investigated did not return. The building had been evacuated during the crisis and not yet cleared for reoccupation, leaving it isolated, abandoned, a perfect refuge for anything that wished to remain hidden. Aya entered the building alone, ascending through its 77 floors in a gauntlet that tested everything she had learned. NMCs infested every level, creatures that should not have existed if Eve and the ultimate being had been truly destroyed. They were stronger than those she had faced during the main crisis, more varied in their forms and capabilities, as though someone had been deliberately creating and cultivating them. Each floor presented new challenges, new configurations of enemies, new environmental hazards. She fought her way upward, floor after floor, her resources depleting, her reserves draining, determination alone sustaining her when everything else was exhausted. At the top of the building, on the 77th floor, Aya found something that rewrote her understanding of everything that had happened. A cocoon hung in the center of the space, organic material woven into a structure that pulsed with inner light. Within that cocoon, she could see a figure developing, could make out features that seemed somehow familiar. When the cocoon opened, when its occupant emerged to face her, Aya found herself looking at what appeared to be another Eve, another mitochondrial consciousness given physical form. This was the purebred Eve, an entity developed from mitochondrial samples that Clamp had preserved and cultivated over the years. When Melissa's Eve and the ultimate being failed, this backup had continued developing, had been waiting in the Chrysler Building for the moment when it would emerge. The figure before Aya reminded her of Maya, features that echoed her sister's face, though whether this was literal resemblance or something filtered through Aya's own perceptions and the connection they shared remained unclear. The purebred Eve did not speak as Melissa's Eve had spoken, did not explain its plans or justify its existence. It simply attacked, demonstrating power that exceeded anything Aya had previously faced. The battle at the top of the Chrysler Building was the most difficult of Aya's life. The purebred Eve possessed abilities similar to the most powerful techniques Aya herself had developed, could match her parasite energy with equivalent force, could survive damage that would have destroyed any previous opponent. They fought across the observation deck, energy clashing with energy, two beings whose mitochondria shared common origin, but had developed along incompatible paths. The windows shattered, the walls cracked. The building itself seemed to groan under the strain of their conflict. Aya pushed beyond every limit she had discovered, accessed reserves of power she had not known she possessed. The purebred Eve matched her, countered her, refused to fall despite damage that should have been fatal. The battle seemed to last forever, seemed to exist outside normal time. Two forces locked in a conflict that could only end with one's destruction. Finally, through a combination of skill and desperation, and perhaps something that could only be called luck, Aya landed a decisive blow. The purebred Eve staggered, its form destabilizing, its cells beginning the cascade toward necrosis. But even as the purebred Eve died, something unexpected happened. The mitochondria inside Aya's own body began to destabilize. Her cells, which had grown more powerful through the trials she had endured, had developed to a point where they were vulnerable to being taken over. The dying Eve consciousness reached out, seeking a new host, attempting to claim Aya as its vessel. For a terrible moment, Aya felt herself slipping away, felt her identity being submerged beneath something alien and hungry. But something intervened, whether it was Maya's consciousness preserved in those shared cells, or simply a biological compatibility that worked in Aya's favor, or something that defied any explanation science could provide. The takeover was prevented. The Eve consciousness was purged, expelled from Aya's body, destroyed by whatever force had protected her throughout the crisis. She was left standing alone at the top of the Chrysler Building, exhausted beyond measure, changed by what she had experienced, but still herself. The ambiguity of what exactly happened in that final moment was deliberate, left unresolved by the narrative. Had Maya truly protected her sister from beyond death? Was their genuine consciousness preserved in mitochondrial structures, personality persisting in cellular form? Or was it simply biology operating according to patterns that happened to benefit Aya, chance, and chemistry, combining in fortunate ways? The answer remained uncertain, open to interpretation based on individual beliefs about consciousness and identity and the nature of self. What was clear was that Aya had survived, had faced the ultimate test, and emerged intact. She had gained some kind of deeper connection to her dead sister, a bond that would remain with her regardless of how it was explained. Maya's protection, whatever form it truly took, had been present throughout the crisis and would continue into whatever future awaited. The sisters who had been separated by death remained connected through biology, through memory, through something that transcended easy categorization. The complete story of Parasite Eve is ultimately about what it means to be human when the biological systems we depend on behave in unexpected ways. We are communities of cells working together, partnerships between different components that we take for granted, until something goes wrong. The mitochondria in our cells have their own genetic code, their own evolutionary history, their own patterns of behavior that usually align with our interests, but are not guaranteed to do so forever. The events of December 1997 demonstrated that this biological partnership, stable for billions of years, could malfunction in catastrophic ways, could produce threats that conventional understanding was not prepared to address. Aya Brea's journey from ordinary detective to someone capable of confronting biological horror illuminates the resilience that exists in unexpected places. She did not choose to become what she became. The cornea transplant that protected her was a medical procedure, not a deliberate enhancement. But when circumstances demanded more than ordinary human capability, she rose to meet them, using abilities she did not ask for in service of protecting others. Her example suggests that heroism is not about possessing special powers, but about using whatever capabilities we have in service of something greater than ourselves. The relationship between Aya and Maya provides the emotional core of the entire narrative. Sisters separated by death, connected through biology, one protecting the other in ways that defied easy explanation. Maya died years before the events of the game, yet her influence persisted, her cells apparently shielding Aya from the combustion that killed so many others. Whether this protection represented conscious choice or biological accident, the emotional truth remained the same. Aya survived because of her sister. The love between them found expression even across the boundary of death. Daniel Dollis serves as the everyman perspective, the ordinary person caught up in extraordinary events who represents humanity at its most fundamental level. He cannot channel parasite energy, cannot survive the combustion effect, cannot match the biological capabilities that Aya develops. But he contributes what he can, his experience as an investigator, his courage in dangerous situations, his willingness to risk everything to get those special bullets to Aya when she needed them. His jacket catching fire during that desperate delivery became an almost comedic moment amid the horror, a reminder that ordinary people can make a difference even when facing the extraordinary, that heroism comes in many forms. Maida represents scientific knowledge applied to crisis, understanding used to find solutions rather than simply satisfy curiosity. His contribution, developing bullets containing Aya's cells, proved decisive in the battle against the ultimate being. His explanation of Maya's cornea transplant provided the emotional resolution that the action climax could not deliver alone. He demonstrated that knowledge, properly applied, can help address even unprecedented threats, that understanding is a weapon as powerful as any firearm. The horror elements of the story serve to highlight its emotional core rather than overshadow it. The spontaneous combustion, the mutated creatures, the body horror of transformation, all create contrast against which the themes of connection and protection become more visible. We fear losing control of our bodies precisely because our bodies are how we exist in the world, how we connect with others, how we express love and receive it. The threat Eve represented was not just physical death, but the loss of bodily autonomy, the transformation of self into something unrecognizable, the reduction of identity to raw biological material. The game's structure, spanning 6 days from Christmas Eve through the crisis, with the Chrysler Building as epilogue, creates a narrative of transformation appropriate to the holiday setting. The season traditionally represents transition, the end of one year and the beginning of another, darkness giving way to light. Aya begins the story as an ordinary detective and ends it as something more, someone who has faced biological horror and emerged changed but intact. Her transformation parallels the seasonal one. Crisis overcome, normalcy restored, life continuing despite everything that tried to end it. Carnegie Hall, where the story begins, represents human culture at its most refined, the transformation of sound into art, the ability to create beauty that transcends individual existence. Its desecration by Eve's attack symbolizes vulnerability, the ease with which everything we build can be swept away by forces we do not understand. But the story does not end in destruction. It ends with the city recovering, with people returning to their lives, with culture and community persisting despite the horrors that threaten them. The resilience of human civilization, its ability to absorb shocks and continue, becomes part of the story's ultimate message. The setting of New York City grounds the fantastic elements in recognizable reality. The landmarks that appear throughout the game, Carnegie Hall, Central Park, the museum, the Chrysler Building, are real places that players might have visited, might walk past in their daily lives. This immediacy makes the horror more visceral, the threat more personal. The suggestion that the cells in your own body might malfunction catastrophically becomes more frightening when set in a place you might actually inhabit, when the victims are people who could have been your neighbors. The character of Aya Brea provided a model for female protagonists that influenced many subsequent games. She was a competent professional doing her job under extraordinary circumstances. Her femininity was acknowledged without being made central to her identity or exploited for titillation. Her relationships with other characters were based on professional respect and shared purpose rather than romance. She demonstrated that women could anchor action narratives without being reduced to stereotypes, could be heroes in the full sense of the word. The game's exploration of biological horror engaged with fears that are fundamental to human existence. We all live in bodies we do not fully control, subject to illness and injury and aging that we cannot prevent. We depend on processes we cannot consciously direct, on systems that usually function properly, but sometimes do not. The story gave form to these anxieties, transformed diffuse unease into specific threat, allowed engagement with fears through narrative. And then it offered resolution, not through denial of vulnerability, but through demonstration that even when biology goes wrong, human determination and connection can prevail. The Chrysler Building sequence, while optional content, provided crucial closure to the story's emotional arc. Without it, the relationship between Aya and Maya remained somewhat abstract, a matter of genetic inheritance and cellular memory. The EX game made that relationship more concrete, more personal, more emotionally resonant. Maya's protection of Aya, whatever form it truly took, became the culmination of everything the story had been building toward, a final testament to the power of sisterly love. The ambiguity about whether Maya's consciousness truly persists, or whether the protection Aya receives is simply biological compatibility, is deliberately maintained throughout the narrative. The game suggests answers without confirming them, leaving room for interpretation based on individual beliefs about consciousness and identity, and the nature of what makes us who we are. Players who prefer materialist explanations can read the story as biology operating according to patterns, mitochondria behaving in ways that happen to benefit their host without requiring any awareness behind that behavior. Players who prefer more spiritual interpretations can read the same events as genuine consciousness surviving death, as personality persisting in cellular structures, as love transcending biological limitation. Both readings are supported by what the story presents, and neither is definitively confirmed or denied. This interpretive space is one of the narrative's greatest strengths. It allows different people to find different meanings in the same events, to connect with the story in ways that resonate with their own beliefs and experiences. The questions Parasite Eve raises about biology and consciousness and identity do not have definitive answers in the real world either, and the game's willingness to leave them unresolved reflects an honesty about the limits of human knowledge that more didactic narratives often lack. The ending of the main game, with Aya at the harbour as emergency crews manage the aftermath of the ultimate being's destruction, provides closure while acknowledging change. She has defeated Eve, destroyed the ultimate being, survived against impossible odds, but she has also been transformed by the experience, has developed abilities that set her apart from ordinary humanity, has discovered a connection to a dead sister that will persist for the rest of her life. The story is complete, but Aya's journey continues. She will carry what she has learned and what she has become into whatever future awaits, changed but not diminished, different but still recognizably herself. The complete story of Parasite Eve reminds us that our bodies are complex systems, partnerships between different biological components that we take for granted until something goes wrong. It asks us to consider what happens when those systems malfunction, when the cellular machinery we depend on behaves in unexpected ways. And it suggests that even when facing biological horror, human courage and connection can make the difference between survival and destruction, between being victims of our biology and being masters of our fate. Aya's journey from ordinary detective to extraordinary survivor illuminates something important about human potential. She did not choose her immunity, did not ask for her abilities, did not seek out the crisis that transformed her life. But when circumstances demanded more than she thought she could give, she found the strength to meet them. She discovered reserves of courage and capability that she did not know she possessed, that perhaps none of us know we possess until we are tested. Her example suggests that we are often capable of more than we imagine, that crisis can reveal strengths we did not know were there, that the limits we assume for ourselves are frequently less fixed than they appear. The story also suggests that those we have lost remain with us in ways we might not fully understand. Maya died years before the events of the game, but her influence persisted, her cells protecting Aya, her presence felt in moments of crisis and connection. Whether this represents genuine consciousness surviving death, or simply the biological legacy of organ donation, the emotional truth is the same. The people we love become part of us, literally and figuratively, and that connection does not end simply because they are no longer physically present. We carry them with us, in memory and in meaning, and perhaps in ways that science has not yet learned to measure. The scientific concepts underlying the story, while obviously exaggerated for dramatic effect, engage with genuine questions about biology and consciousness. Mitochondria really are the powerhouses of cells, really do possess their own DNA, really did originate as independent organisms that merged with our ancestors billions of years ago. The concept of mitochondrial Eve, the common ancestor of all human mitochondrial lineages, is scientifically supported. The possibility that cellular structures might preserve information in ways we do not fully understand remains an open question, explored by researchers studying cellular memory and biological inheritance. Parasite Eve takes these genuine scientific elements and extrapolates them into horror, asking what if the speculation proved true? What if the partnership we take for granted became something else entirely? The legacy of this story extends beyond its immediate narrative to influence how we think about biology and identity, about the relationship between our conscious selves and the cellular processes that make consciousness possible. As biotechnology advances, as we gain ability to modify our own cells with increasing precision, the questions the game raises become less speculative and more practical. What does it mean to be human when we can alter our own biology? How much can we change before we become something else? Where is the line between enhancement and transformation, between healing and mutation? These questions have no easy answers, but engaging with them through narrative helps us develop frameworks for thinking about them when they become urgent. The horror genre has always been about more than simple fear. At its best, horror uses frightening scenarios to explore deeper truths about human existence, to confront anxieties that we might otherwise avoid, to process fears through the safe medium of fiction. Parasite Eve exemplifies this function, using biological horror to explore themes of identity and connection, of loss and persistence, of what we owe to those who came before us and those who will come after. The monsters in the game are frightening, but they are not the point. The point is what facing those monsters reveals about the characters who face them, about the bonds that sustain them, about the courage they find when courage seems impossible. The game's influence on subsequent horror and science fiction cannot be overstated. It demonstrated that complex biological concepts could be made accessible and engaging through interactive narrative. It showed that female protagonists could carry action horror without being sexualized or diminished. It proved that emotional depth and psychological complexity could coexist with exciting gameplay and spectacular set pieces. Many games that followed drew on its example, learning from what it did well, building on the foundations it established. For those who experienced the story when it was first released in the late 1990s, it remains a touchstone, a formative experience that shaped their understanding of what games could accomplish. For those encountering it now, it offers a window into an earlier era of game design while still delivering narrative and thematic content that feels relevant and meaningful. The questions it asks about biology and consciousness have only become more pressing as technology advances. The emotional core of sisterly love transcending death remains as powerful as ever. As we close this exploration of Parasite Eve's complete narrative, consider what the story suggests about your own existence. The mitochondria in your cells are working right now, converting oxygen into energy, powering every thought you think, every breath you take. They have been doing this since before you were born and will continue until the moment you die. They carry DNA that traces back through your mother's line, through her mother's line, through generations beyond counting to the common ancestor from whom all human mitochondria descend. You are, in a very real sense, not a single organism, but a community, a partnership between different biological components that have learned to work together over billions of years of evolution. Perhaps that partnership is as simple and mechanical as biology textbooks suggest, chemical processes following chemical rules without awareness or intention. Perhaps it is something more, something we do not yet have the scientific vocabulary to describe. Either way, it seems worth acknowledging, worth appreciating, worth treating with the respect that any partnership deserves. We are not alone in our bodies. We never have been. And perhaps, if the story of Parasite Eve has any wisdom to offer, it is that we should be grateful for the company, should honor the partnership that makes our existence possible, should recognize that we are always more than we appear to be, always connected to something larger than our individual selves. The city of New York recovered from the crisis, as cities always recover, as human communities always find ways to continue despite the disasters that befall them. The scars remained, physical and psychological, But life went on. People returned to Carnegie Hall eventually, sat in the same seats where others had died, listened to music and opera and performances that honored the cultural traditions the building represented. They did not forget what had happened, but they refused to let that memory prevent them from living, from creating, from finding beauty in a world that sometimes seemed determined to destroy it. Aya Brea continued her work, protecting a city that would never fully know how much she had sacrificed for it, how close it had come to destruction, how narrowly disaster had been averted. She carried Maya with her, in her cells and in her heart, the sister she had lost, and the sister she had found again through circumstances no one could have predicted. She remained vigilant, remained ready, remained committed to the work of protection and service that had defined her career from the beginning. And somewhere in the cells of her body, in the mitochondria that powered her every movement, Maya remained as well, watching over her little sister, keeping her safe, loving her across the boundary that separates the living from the dead. If this journey through biological horror and human courage has sparked thoughts about what it means to live in bodies we do not fully control, about the connections that sustain us and the losses that shape us, consider reflecting on those thoughts. The questions Parasite Eve raises about biology and identity and consciousness do not have definitive answers, and perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps some questions are meant to be lived rather than solved, explored rather than concluded, carried with us as we make our way through lives that are always more mysterious than they appear. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember that even in the darkest moments, the bonds we share with those we love can light the way forward.